Today we will be discussing the social nature of language learning. What does it really mean to know a language? People trying to learn a second language often focus on memorizing grammar rules, vocabulary, and pronunciation. Many language courses teach and test the rules of language. However, research has shown that the ability to memorize the rules of grammar or a list of vocabulary words does not necessarily result in the ability to successfully communicate in that language. Students who memorize language rules may perform well on standardized tests, but it is still very difficult for others to understand them when they speak or write. Why is this? It's quite simple, actually. Language is social. Think about it. What use would language be if you were the only person in the world? It wouldn't be very useful or very important for you to learn a language, any language, without someone to talk to. That's because the primary purpose of language is to communicate with other people. Language allows us to communicate ideas, share feelings, express opinions, build arguments, make requests, and interact with others. What this means is that memorizing rules is not enough. Speakers need to be able to use language meaningfully to express themselves and communicate in many different situations. In fact, many native speakers learn a language without ever explicitly learning all of the rules of the language. For example, how many of you can explain the passive voice? Or who can tell me what a relative clause is? Chances are, unless you studied a language, you may not be able to identify or explain these parts of language. However, you likely use both every day and can recognize when someone uses them incorrectly. It's very common for speakers of a language to be able to use the language fluently without being able to explain the specific rules behind it. This is because language learning is subconscious. Speakers of a language know what sounds right and what doesn't sound right, but they are not always sure how they know. This innate understanding of language becomes even clearer when you consider how children learn their first language. Children learn language by listening to and interacting with their parents, siblings, and other people. By the time they are 4 or 5, most children are able to express themselves clearly without ever having someone teach them the rules of grammar. In fact, Michael Halliday, a famous linguist, suggests that children start learning the language significantly earlier in their development than they start learning about language. Children start learning language because they need to communicate with those around them. However, they do not start learning about language or learning the formal terms and rules of language until they start school. By this time, they are already using language regularly to communicate with others. This suggests that exposure to a language by listening to and socializing with other people is the most natural way of learning a language. What does this mean for learning a second language? It means that you will be a more successful language learner if you are regularly exposed to the language and try to use the target language as much as possible. Don't just memorize lists of vocabulary or the rules of the language. Use the language to communicate with others. Speak to native speakers or your classmates using the target language. Read newspapers, books, articles, or other texts written in the language as much as possible. The more exposure a language learner has to the language and the more they use it to communicate, the more successful they will be in learning the language. Today we will be discussing the social nature of language learning. What does it really mean to know a language? People trying to learn a